Thank you, Arminda. That was great. Thanks to all your crew as well. Uh, Now we can get this really started. If you haven't been here before, welcome. Houston Oasis is Houston's very own secular community, and we meet here every Sunday. And we're joined by some of our core values. I can point to some of them. The people are more important than beliefs, and human hands solve human problems. Uh, Let's get this started. So today's speaker is Dr. Matthew Facciani. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame in the Computer Science and Engineering Department. His talk is entitled The Power of Identities and How to Have Productive Conversations, and will describe how identities influence our information processing and create susceptibility and polarization and misinformation. Um, Without any further ado, let's welcome Dr. Matthew Facciani.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you. It's great to be here. Can I go ahead and share my screen? Okay, perfect.
Yes,
all right.
Good. We're good.
All right, all good?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to you all about identities and how they influence us, but then also how we can learn about how they influence us in order to have more productive conversations. So the first thing I wanted to get started with is just defining what do I even mean by identity. And in the sociological and social psychology literature, one of the main definitions that I really like is thinking about identity as a set of meanings. And this set of meanings defines individuals in terms of the roles they occupy, the social categories or groups they belong to, and the individual characteristics that define them as unique persons. So there's three real types of main identities that we have. We have these role identities, these social identities, and then these individual person identities. So that's one way to think of them, but they all have a set of meanings that guide us in our behavior. So for example, we might have an atheist identity. And this atheist identity might have certain roles, such as going to atheist events or doing certain atheist activism, for example. And maybe we're a sports fan, so maybe that's a social group that we belong to, and we want to go to sporting events with our friends who are also sports fans, and that will guide us behavior in that way. And then we can have individual characteristics that are types of identities too. So let's say we think of ourselves as a skeptical person, and the skeptical person identity is going to motivate us to learn new things and be skeptical of the information we encounter in our worlds. So all of these identities come together and influence us to interact with the world and other people in different ways. And the reason they have this influence over us is because of this information feedback loop that is fueled by our identity processes. So we're motivated to maintain consistency between the values and the meanings of our identities and our worlds and our social environments. So we constantly have this motivation to what's called verify our identity or identity verification. Whenever we support or verify an identity that's important to us, it gives us a boost of self-esteem and we feel good about ourselves because that's a way that we can reaffirm our sense of self and how we fit into the social fabric of our lives. So again, we might be motivated to go to different events, go to different, support our sports team, or just navigate the world in a way that makes us feel good about our skeptical identity, for example, by being skeptical and constantly verifying that identity through our behaviors and our actions. So this is a constant psychological process where we have this feedback loop of rewarding ourselves with a self-esteem boost every time we behave in a way that's consistent with our identities. And our identities are not in isolation. We often have hundreds of identities, maybe even thousands of identities. And we can think of the main ones that we have in terms of a social identity map and see how they connect with each other. So again, if we have our atheist identity, maybe that is more related to our skeptical identity. There's some overlap there in the shared meanings and shared values, and maybe our skeptical identity led us to being an atheist, or atheist identity inspires us to be more skeptical, for example. But if we're also a sports fan, maybe that's not connected at all to these other two identities. And they really don't even come into contact or conflict because they're completely separate from our atheist and skeptical identity. And when we think about how all of these identities connect with each other, this goes into what's called social identity complexity. And basically what that means is whenever we have many important identities that do not easily overlap, that's greater social identity complexity. And this is important because whenever we have this higher social identity complexity, we're more likely to be open-minded and tolerant towards different groups because we can think of the complexities other people have as well. And also, when people have more intergroup contact, they tend to have this higher social identity complexity as well. So to give you some examples of low versus high social identity complexity, let's say we have our religious identity, our political identity, our volunteer identity, and our friend identity, and they all overlap. So let's say we go to church, and all of our church group, or also our core friend group, we all volunteer together, and we all vote the same way, and we all think the same way about political and social issues. So if these are completely overlapping with each other, that would represent a lower degree of social identity complexity because all of your identities have a lot of overlap with each other, and there isn't a lot of conflict or contradiction when you think about your own identity maps and identity processes. Conversely, if we have high social identity complexity, let's say we have our political identity and religious identity that may have some overlap, but there's also some disagreement between them. And when we volunteer, maybe we volunteer for a completely different group that doesn't connect with our political or religious identity at all. Maybe it's for like a pet shelter or something that doesn't have any sort of direct relationship to our political and religious identities. And then the friend groups that we have, maybe they are completely separate from our political and religious identity as well, and maybe they even have different politics or religious ideology than us. So this would represent higher degree of social identity complexity and would connect to a greater likelihood of being open-minded about different topics and meanings related to identities because we're constantly navigating different identity worlds. So when I think about my identity map, and you can go ahead and make your identity map on your own too, I think it's a useful exercise. So I have my friend identity, different friends that I've met throughout the years, but an example of how they could connect with something else is I'm the captain of my softball team. So some of my friends are on my softball team, but I have my softball captain identity where I have to make the lineups and organize the games, and also have my friend identity. And sometimes these can even intersect with each other and conflict with each other. So if I have a friend who's not doing well, I might have to move them down the lineup, and that's going to conflict with my softball identity because I want our softball team to do well, and I also want to be a good friend. And sometimes that can cause some conflict. So as you think about your identity map, it's also really important to think about when your identities conflict and even contradict sometimes. So not only just spatially where they are and how they're connected, but whenever they do connect, what happens whenever they intersect in a way that can cause conflict between the two of them. I also have my political identity. I'm left of center with my politics, and my religious identity, I'm an atheist. And sometimes these identities do connect in a lot of different ways. So for example, I really value separation of church and state, and that can connect both my atheist identity and political identity sometimes. And another type of identity I have is my volunteer identity. I volunteered for a variety of different groups. One is I used to work at my local science center, and that really doesn't connect to any of these identities here. And it was a totally different group of people. So this is a little bit more spread out than that super focused identity map that I showed you earlier. And again, that's just an extreme example. But generally, we can use these identity maps to think about how our identities intersect and how they connect spatially. So why does all this matter? Well, as many of us know, we live in a very polarized world, especially in the United States. And these polarized political identities can really influence our thoughts and behavior. So when we think back about the power of identity and information processing, there's this identity feedback loop. We gain motivation. We have this motivation to enact our actions and our behaviors in a way that's consistent with these identities. And if it's just motivating us to show up to an atheist event or showing up to a sporting event, maybe that's pretty neutral or even good. But if we have a political identity that's motivating us to interpret facts a different way, then that may not be so good. So if we're really motivated to protect our own political team, in a way that is going to bias us and how we process information, then this is how we can start to see how identities can influence how we process information. And political identities are really big ones because there's so much political information out there, and there's so much opportunity to find people who share our political beliefs, which can create another element of bias as well. And that's what I wanted to talk about next, is this intersection of identities and networks. So not only do we have this motivation to protect our own identity through our thoughts and behaviors, but then we also want to be around people who are like us. And this is called homophily in the literature. So just this tendency to be around people who share characteristics with us. And focusing on politics again, generally Democrats and Republicans have very politically homogeneous networks. These are two examples of Facebook networks. The blue dots are Democrats, the red dots are Republicans. And these are just average Democrat and Republican profiles. And you can probably guess which one is which, with the one on the left having more blue is the typical Democrat, the one on the right having more red is your typical Republican. And studies have shown that average Facebook users have only about 23% of friends of the opposing political party. That study was from a few years ago, so it might even be lower. And this is consistent across various social media platforms. It's not just Facebook. So again, when we think about identities and networks, there's two processes that interact with each other and strengthen each other. First, we have this motivation to verify and support our identities ourselves. And then we have this motivation to be around people who are similar to us. And the people that are similar to us are also motivated to verify their own identities. So we're constantly around people who are verifying their identities that are like ours, and then we're sharing and verifying our identity with them too. So for example, if we're on Facebook and we share a news link that supports our own political group, other people are going to see that Facebook post, and then that might motivate them to reshare it or mention something else about politics that supports that political position, and it constantly mutually reinforces each other. And another way to think of this is a mutual identity verification. And whenever people are around people who share their beliefs and worldviews, the greater number of homogeneity in their networks does predict more extreme beliefs. And this is some research that I've looked into where we find that having a completely homogeneous network is significantly more polarized than even just having one person who disagrees with your politics in your close network. So that's the motivational processes of the identity feedback loop and network processes with identities. We can also think back to how that connects to this idea of social identity complexity. So again, when people have these lower degrees of social identity complexity and all of their political groups and friend groups and religious groups are all overlapping 100%, that's a very low degree of social identity complexity. And having that low degree of social identity complexity makes it harder to see other perspectives because all of your identities are constantly aligned in one direction. So some researchers have suggested that if we try to understand our own identity maps and try to think of the complexity among our own identities, this can help us reduce polarization within ourselves because we're reflecting on our own identity processes and trying to see how we could have things in common with other people, even if we disagree with politics, for example. So again, if all of these identities are completely overlapping and not having any sort of conflict, and we don't even think about that conflict, then we might see the world in a more simple way that can make us a little bit less open-minded and tolerant towards other people. So whenever we have these sorts of very low amounts of social identity complexity and we're not interacting with people that are different than us, because again, remember, we're motivated to be around people who are similar to us. So this fuels our decreasing of social identity complexity. And all of these processes are constantly bolstering each other and creating even a stronger motivation to support those identities. And we can see that all of these processes interacting with each other with homophily, identity verification, and then this low degree of social identity complexity can create really large political polarization. And this is just one example of showing political polarization, that the median Democrat, median Republican have become more left-wing and more right-wing over time. But even more worrisome than just ideological polarization, I think, is this growing dislike of political outgroups. So in the last 30 years or so, we have seen a really strong decline in how positive in-group members feel towards their out-group. So both Democrats and Republicans together are much more strong in their dislike of the opposing party in the past 20 years. So you can see in the 80s, there was about a 25-point gap on a 100-degree scale of how warm you felt towards your opposing party. And just recently, there's now about a 50-point gap. So it's almost double as far as our negative feelings towards the out-group in just the last 20 or 30 years. So this is really concerning for how we interpret the world. So for example, one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans agree on is that they cannot agree on basic facts. And again, this is really tied to our identities, that we're so motivated to protect our identities, we process basic facts very differently. And as we've seen recently with the COVID-19 virus, even from the start, Democrats and Republicans really interpreted how to protect themselves against the virus and how serious they thought the virus was right from the beginning. And this has been consistent throughout the pandemic. We see this very large disagreement on a virus, which should be something that we could hopefully find some common ground with. But again, because we have these identities that motivate us to process information differently, it really sparks some disagreement that can be very long lasting. Another important example of this was with the 2020 election, where most Democrats believed it to be legitimate and accurate, whereas most Republicans did not agree it was legitimate and accurate. So this is going to be, unfortunately, potentially reoccurring issue in our future elections as well. And this disagreement on facts is all on the background of these feelings of political violence that are rising. So as this figure shows here, just in the last 5 or 6 years, we're seeing this growing number of Democrats and Republicans who both believe that they feel justified to use violence to advance political goals. So really, really important and harrowing information here about our society and how we can think about the social psychology that motivates some of these processes. So the good news is I do think there are a few techniques that can help us turn down the heat a little bit and try to reduce polarization, at least on a micro level. So for the rest of the talk, I'll be focusing on 5 steps to have more productive conversations. And again, this is just focusing on the psychology on if we're interested in trying to have a more productive conversation with someone who thinks differently than us, and hopefully inspire them to have future conversations as well. So these 5 steps I'll go into greater detail, but they are respect, relate, reframe, revise, and repeat. So I had them all start with R to make it more simple here. So the first one, establish respect for each other. So as we probably all know, generally when we're having a conversation with someone, it's going to go better if there's some sort of mutual respect when we have our disagreement. So this is consistent with a lot of psychology research as well. When people feel respected and heard, they avoid these defensive biases, they don't double down, and they feel more satisfied with the conversation. It's just a much more positive feeling whenever you feel like the other person is really listening to you and respecting you, even if you disagree. So whenever we think about listening and talking to other people, we should think of it as an active and collaborative process by seeking to understand their point of view, resisting their urge to judge, and constantly being curious. Curiosity can be really important for how we navigate and try to reflect on how someone came to that belief. So if we're having this conversation and someone says something we disagree with, really trying to be curious on where that belief started from and how that belief has persisted over time can be helpful. And the importance of mutual respect can be really apparent whenever we think about whenever it's not available. So research has shown that whenever there's superficial exposure with the outgroup, such as following a politician on Twitter, having political conversations on Twitter or social media, this can actually increase polarization. So it's not just the mere exposure of an opposing viewpoint that can help, but if that exposure is in a very limited or superficial environment, it can actually make people feel even more polarized. And this connects back to these identity processes where whenever someone is having their identity made more salient in their minds, it can increase polarization. So if you're just having an exposure to a tweet or something on social media that makes you think about politics, that can increase polarization by itself, as opposed to having a meaningful relationship and conversation with people who think differently than you. And whenever we have these meaningful connections with other people who have diverse viewpoints, my research has shown that this does relate to reducing polarization. And this is consistent with other research as well. And there's even causal research for this too. It's not just a correlation between people who tend to agree with them, other people have networks that are similar to them. It's whenever we actually have moderated discussion with people who think differently than us, this can reduce polarization. And one example of this that has been interesting has been whenever we see how children can change parents' minds about climate change compared to other children that are not theirs or strangers. Parents are much more likely to both listen to their children about climate change and the impacts of climate in the future because they have this existing connection that's really meaningful. But the last point I want to say about mutual respect is that this key ingredient of constructive conversations is really that mutual aspect here. So this is a quote by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist who talks to lots of different people about climate change. And she explicitly mentions here that if the respect is not mutual and cannot be fostered, she recommends just to step away and spend your time elsewhere. So you may not be able to reach one particular person, but you can use that energy on other people who are a bit more open-minded, and you can have a more productive conversation with them. So that's the first step, establishing this mutual respect with each other to increase your chances of having productive conversation. The next step is thinking back to those identity processes and trying to use them to our advantage in these conversations. So we know that identity has a really important influence on how we process information. So this can help us whenever we have these conversations because we can try to connect with someone through a common in-group identity. And whenever we have this common in-group identity, it can actually help reduce division and bias among identities that we do not have in common. Because people are generally more receptive to information from in-group members, any sort of in-group membership you share builds trust and respect automatically. So research has shown that whenever Democrats and Republicans are in an experiment and they're asked to reflect on their common American identity, this can reduce political bias. And another study that came out more recently showed that pairing people together who have shared common interests outside of politics can help reduce polarization down the line. So this is a longitudinal study where they had people basically email each other over a series of months. And initially, they were just talking about things they had in common, like sports or music or art. And those who had things in common initially were more likely to have reduced polarization whenever they eventually found out that their discussion partner disagreed in their politics. So by having this shared in-group identity initially made them much more likely to listen and feel heard when they have these political conversations, which then in turn reduced polarization later. And that did not happen when people didn't have much in common at the start of this experiment. So it really shows the highlights of sharing identities when you have conversations. Another example of this, whenever I attended this empathy workshop built on trying to have productive conversations, it was led by Ray McTuffie, who is a science communicator, and she really focused on the importance of being engaging, not dismissive. And we just had this exercise where we role played a different point of view and really try to think about the other person's perspective. And then also think about what we have in common with them. So maybe we don't have religion in common or our love of fishing in common, but maybe we're both parents and we can talk about the challenges of being a parent and the joys of being a parent and how we both want best for our children, and then use that shared identity to have a mutual starting point for the conversations that we disagree with. Okay, so we have mutual respect for each other. We have a motivation to use that identity process to connect with someone through a shared identity. Next, we can start thinking about reframing the conversation to address their concerns. So another quote I wanted to share by another science communicator, Emily Calandrelli. She talks to a lot of different audiences about science as well. And I asked her, what's your one tip about communicating science to different people? And as you can see here, she really highlighted the importance of knowing your audience. And again, we probably all know this to some degree, that the audience is important, but we often forget about it. So I think it's really important to reiterate it as much as possible, because we may care about a specific point for our own reasons, but someone may care about it, that same point, but maybe for very different reasons. And finding out what those reasons are can help us have much more productive dialogue and conversations. So there's been some research looking at how generally liberals and conservatives have different points of emphasis for their values. So liberals tend to have more greater emphasis on the value of protection from harm and the value of fairness. Conservatives generally have more emphasis on loyalty, respect, and purity. Both liberals and conservatives value liberty. And again, these are in general. Basically, liberals and conservatives generally have all of these values, but it's just which ones do they emphasize more and more often. And whenever we frame arguments that are in terms of these different values, we find that experiments show that people are much more likely to change their viewpoint or support different types of legislation when they're in those particular values. So for example, conservatives are much more likely to support pro-environmental legislation when framed in terms of purity rather than harm. And liberals are much more likely to support military spending when framed in terms of how it can help low-income people. So again, if you're presenting your viewpoint in a way that's consistent with someone's pre-existing values, you're going to have much more likelihood of them listening to it and potentially even changing their mind. So another example of this that some studies have shown is that regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, conservative white evangelicals were more likely to support wearing masks whenever they saw this message was given in terms of a religious framework. So equating wearing a mask to loving your neighbor and thinking of it in this more religious way, or if the message was from Republican Donald Trump saying that mask use is patriotic. So this was just in the experiment, people were more likely to endorse wearing masks. So ideally, if this would have helped, this may have helped outside of the experiment too, if there's more religious leaders and Republican leaders really stressing the importance of wearing masks, then we might have seen more people wearing masks who were also Republican, potentially. So we have established mutual respect for each other. We've related to a shared identity. We've reframed the position to connect with our audience or the person we're talking to. Now we can start thinking about how do we actually revise our questions and our language so it's more productive. And one way to think about this is to increase the amount of reflection generally in your conversation. So the amount of analytical thinking you can promote in your conversation is always going to be helpful. And this is because research has shown that people who are asked to reflect on accuracy are less likely to believe and share fake news. And this is because there's this term in psychology called type 2 thinking, which is more analytical, thoughtful processing of information, that anytime you can get people in this type of mindset, they're more likely to change their attitudes, they're more likely to be more open-minded and careful about how they process information. This is different than type 1 thinking, which is more automatic and intuitive type of processing of information. So we really want to try to inspire type 2 thinking. And research has shown this can be activated by just asking people to reflect on if they know something is true before they share something on social media. Additionally, research has shown that whenever people are in a group discussion, which is usually can increase polarization, but if the group discussion has a moderator that asks people to be more deliberate and thoughtful about their viewpoints, just having someone guide them in doing that can reduce polarization among this like-minded discussion. So some techniques are using the Socratic method, applied epistemology, really questioning how they know what they know and how confident are they. So this question of how is really important versus why, because asking for reasons to justify beliefs can actually increase polarization. So if you just ask someone, why do you believe that? They can go on and give their justifications, and they're not really reflecting on how they came to that point. But if you ask people to describe the step-by-step mechanism of how they came to that belief or how that particular policy will work, this can actually decrease or at least not increase polarization. And when we don't even think about political questions, just asking people how they know something as they're writing essay questions to a variety of questions, asking people how they know something versus why will produce more evidence-based reasons for a variety of apolitical issues. So again, really trying to make people think about that step-by-step mechanism as much as possible can be really helpful. And finally, the last step, which is potentially the most important, but also the simplest, is just repeat. So all of these steps need to be repeated over and over for the greatest chance of success. There's been studies looking at having people learn different types of media literacy and information literacy. And when they learn these techniques, it does reduce their belief and likelihood of sharing misinformation. But these effects are short-lived. So they call this they only last if they give someone a booster where they remind them what they learned and they have them reflect on the information again, because these effects can fade in just a couple weeks or a couple months. So it's similar to having productive conversations. You really need to build relationships and try to connect with people and keep on maintaining that relationship as well. And of course, this takes a lot of time and energy. But there's a few important caveats I wanted to address. So the first one is that empathy is not endorsement. And I really like this quote by Dylan Moran, who is an activist and has a book and a podcast and talks to lots of different people who disagree with him. And he mentions how it's important to try to connect with other people as people and have empathy for them to try to improve the types of conversations they have. But this doesn't mean you're endorsing their point of view. It's just trying to connect with them on a human level and trying to understand the psychology behind increasing the greatest chance of having productive conversations with people who think differently than us. But of course, there are other ways to enact social change. No one has to talk with people they disagree with or people that make them feel unsafe. You can support your own group, you can volunteer your time. There's lots of different ways to enact social change. Again, these steps are just focused on how do we have productive conversations based on what we know about psychology and sociology. So just to briefly give some of my own personal examples of how these steps, or maybe didn't use them, I'd like to share a couple stories here. So generally, I found that that last step, repeat, is really important. I remember I was having a conversation with a conservative friend of mine, and I thought we had a really great conversation, and he really saw my point of view on a lot of different topics. And then we didn't talk for a few months. And then when we talked again and talked about politics, it's like we were starting all over again. And I really think it's just, I was one of his only liberal friends. And if you're not having these sort of regular conversations, it can be really easy to fall back into those identity processes and fall within the influence of our echo chambers of our information environments. So repeat is super important. Also, the medium is really important for trying to get that respect. So as I mentioned before, that Twitter study found that people who just have this brief exposure to someone of a different political group can actually increase polarization. And I found this to be the cases too. Generally, I don't get in online debates with people. I don't find it particularly productive. And I can find it's often really draining to do. So I really try to have these types of conversations in person or at least over the phone as much as possible. Of course, when you have online discussion, other people can read your comments. So the goal may not be to change that one particular person's mind. But again, definitely going to have more success in having productive conversations with people in person. And again, when I say productive conversations, my goal is never to change anyone's mind when I have these types of dialogue. I really just want them to see my own perspective and my own point of view. And then ultimately it's up to them if they're going to change their mind or not. But I at least want to present my position in the way that's going to have the greatest likelihood of resonating with them. And I think these 5 steps can really help. Of course, there's other situations where you might not be able to have these 5 steps. So when I lived in South Carolina, I used to do some scientific testimony where I would talk to different politicians about different issues. And when I'm giving testimony, I really am not having a chance of mutual respect. I'm certainly not going to repeat it. But I could focus my testimony in a way that is maybe more resonant with the politicians. So really trying to connect with things that they care about instead of why I care about this issue. So even if you don't have an opportunity to really build a strong relationship, you can try to reframe and revise your argument in a way that they're going to hear it, at least most likely to hear it. Finally, some other examples. This is a picture of my friend Patrick and I giving a talk about consent, healthy relationships, and bystander intervention when we worked at a sexual trauma center in South Carolina. And we're giving this talk to a bunch of fraternity men at the University of South Carolina, trying to share the information about our organization and how to have healthy relationships and the importance of consent. And we were asked to speak to these groups of men in particular because we were men ourselves. So we could connect with them on a shared identity of being young men, at least at that point. Now I'm probably too old, but that was something that would be helpful because it reduced this kind of defensiveness if they were hearing this information from someone who wasn't in the same peer group as them. And we also had the president of the fraternity association talk about the importance of learning all of this and embracing all of this for their fraternity culture, which I think was helpful as well, again, to use that shared identity. But this was only a presentation. It wasn't sort of an ongoing discussion. That repeat and that mutual respect wasn't able to be fostered because of the format. So those are just a few personal examples of how I've implemented these 5 steps and or how I wasn't able to implement them. Um, so as we wrap up here, one of the last things I wanted to mention is how productive dialogue can help everybody. So it's not just about trying to get your point across to someone else, but we often struggle to recognize our own biases. And conversations with people we disagree with that we trust can help us from being misled as well. So we can recognize our own biases and our own, whenever we have fallen for information ourselves, for example. And whenever we have these positive conversations, maybe that will inspire further conversations from other people. So maybe they will, if we're talking to someone we disagree with, maybe that will inspire them to have a conversation that with someone they disagree with. And this can reduce misperceptions about other people, because generally once we have a conversation with someone, we can understand that maybe they weren't as extreme or as misinformed as we thought. And we can try to inspire more people to have these types of productive dialogue as well. So in conclusion, people often become misled because of social forces, specifically identities. I do think the motivation to protect our identity is really a major factor for political polarization and believing misinformation. But these same social forces that motivate us to interpret information potentially incorrectly, we can also think of them as an opportunity to move us back on track. So again, we can try to connect with people who maybe have become misguided by using a shared identity to connect with them and have a more positive conversation so they're not so stuck in those echo chambers. And again, by doing so, we recognize our own biases more often as well. So again, these steps that I think can be helpful for productive dialogue or mutual respect, relating to a shared identity, reframing our position in a way that addresses their concerns, revising our questions in a way that focuses more on how rather than why, and then repeating all of these steps as often as we can to increase our chances of success. So thank you all so much for listening to me. I'm happy to answer any questions either at the Q&A, or if you have questions later on, you can email me. There's my email there. My website has all my links to my social media and the current work that I'm doing. I do have a book coming out. It's called Misguided. It's all about why we believe misinformation and what we can do about it. The pre-link order should be available soon. If you sign up for my newsletter, which is at this link below, you'll get the pre-order link as soon as it's available. And yeah, thank you all so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Facciani. That was a great conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of questions coming in. Let's take some time to collect all the questions on everybody on here can either write the questions down on your bulletins, or you can ask them in person, and the people online can post on the chat, and we can do that as well. We can ask those questions. I have some announcements here right now. First up, Richard, our treasurer of the board, will come and speak to us.
Don't be scared. This time I'm not going to be asking for your money, but I wanted to mention for those of you that have generously donated to Oasis. Oh, sorry. For those of you who have generously donated to Oasis, I'm sending out the letters so that you can use that information of how much you donated in 2022. I'm sending those letters out this coming week. Make sure if you need that letter for your donations, make sure I have your current contact information. I'll be at the back table there. Also for the compostable coffee cups, we're trying to be green here, so we have a box over there you can put your coffee cups in instead of throwing them in the trash. And And if you have been unable to donate or you have other charities, that's fine. We're still just happy to have you here. So thank you for coming.
All right, next we have Will with some announcements for events coming up.
All right, so we have a book club on May 10th. That's on Wednesday at 7 p.m. and it'll be 6 Feet Over by author Mary Roach. So get that, start reading that and plug into our meetup or the events page on Facebook for more information. And we are putting together a schedule for a secular week of action. So there's a National Day of Prayer, I think sometime in the first week of May. So this secular week of action is kind of a reaction to that. And it's a lot of volunteer events, ways, a lot of humanism, ways to help your fellow human. So we're gonna have a bunch of options for you. So it's the first week of May, but also the weekends before and after. So it's really like 10 days. So there's gonna be a lot of events. Keep an eye out. Plug into our meetup or our Facebook events page to keep in the loop. And this includes a blood drive that's going to happen right back there on April 30th. That's the Sunday gathering. So from 9 to 1. So if you donate blood, hold off until then so you can get credit for it. That's it.
All right, regarding those social media options, we do have a Facebook community as well as a Discord community. Friend anybody in the group who's already plugged in so that we can log into that, you can log into that private group as well as the Discord community. At this moment, let's take a short break to collect questions as well as talk to everyone and reach out, and we'll be right back in about 5 minutes or so. Thank you.
Oh, that's okay. See the ND, I saw that ND, I'm like, what, Dakota? No, Notre Dame. Thank you.
I know. Take care. I'll see you soon. All right, everyone. Can you please take your seats? Let's do some Q&A so that we have enough time. All right. So if you have some questions, Will has the mic back there. Just limit it to the questions. It's only a question, not a statement. And let's go. Go ahead, Will.
Sure, all right. Yep, you don't have too much time for questions. Hi, how you doing? Can you hear me?
Hello. Hi. Yes, I can hear you.
Cool. I'm going to make this very brief. Have you ever done any type of research with people who really don't fall to either stereotype as far as views on issues? Like, I'm speaking for myself with COVID. I oppose the lockdowns, but I've had 4 vaccine shots, and on non-COVID issues, I tend to side with the left. And I don't fit into either category. Um, have you ever done any research with people who kind of follow their own, march to the beat of their own drum?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of the research that I've done and that of other people have done
Matthew,
tend to,
1 minute.
yeah,
1 second. Can you
yeah.
crank it up? Any more? All right, go ahead.
All right. So you're right that there's a lot of people that don't fit into the extreme Republican or Democrat, and there are people that study that. It's just it's a lot more challenging. So with social science, it's easier if we have like groups that are as similar as possible in order to run these statistical analyses of trying to predict their behavior, because trying to predict human behavior is really challenging in general. So it gets a lot easier if we have these more defined boundaries of identities and group membership. And that's why so much research focuses on Democrats and Republicans, or these different groups that fall within these boundaries, because it's easier for the researchers to do that, but also it's important to study these more extreme groups in our political system because they have so much influence on society. So there are studies that look at more independents and moderate people, and there's a lot of interesting questions on like why they believe one aspect of the COVID-19 stuff, but not another one. Um, but as far as my own research, I tend to focus more on Democrats and Republicans. I have looked at independence as well in a study that hopefully should come out soon. We'd looked at vaccine attitudes, but again, mostly focused on Democrats and Republicans, and we use independents as a kind of a control group because for COVID-19, a lot of times independents tend to be more in the middle between Democrats and Republicans, so they can be useful as a control group sometimes.
All right, next question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Quick question. Early in your presentation, you mentioned that both Democrats and Republicans have fairly exclusive networks on Facebook. How representative is Facebook of online interactions?
Yeah, great question. So it's it is a skewed sample because yeah, not everyone's on Facebook and not everyone's on Twitter. So the people that have Facebook and Twitter um, are going to be a different group of people than those who don't. However, there is still a lot of homogeneity within close personal networks, even when we look at just who you talk to in your everyday lives. And it does map on pretty good. Generally, social media can be a little bit more echo chambery, a little bit more polarized than our everyday interactions. But through my own research, just asking people like, who do you discuss important matters with, and giving just 6 people in your everyday life who you discuss these important matters with, I still found that both Democrats and Republicans had a majority of their 6 people tend to align with their politics. So social media can exacerbate some of these echo chamber effects, but even outside of social media, there's still a lot of homogeneity um, in our friend groups and our people we associate with for sure overall.
All right. Any other question? All right. Then thank you, Dr. Facciani, for this talk, and we're glad you were able to make it, and we'll have more conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you.
All right. Now we're gonna have one last song by Ermelinda Cuellar and her team. Let's do that. Finish off this awesome Sunday. Thank you. great. Um, Thanks for joining us today. Lunch will be today at Papa's Barbecue, 7007 59 South. It's about a mile away out here. Uh, Thanks for joining us again, and have a good Sunday. Thank you.